I've never told anyone the full story of what happened at Blackwood Lodge in the winter of '71. For over 50 years, I've carried this burden alone. But I'm getting older now, and someone needs to know the truth. Maybe writing it down will help me finally sleep through the night without seeing their faces pressed against my bedroom window, skin stretched tight over elongated jaws, eyes gleaming with hunger. My name is Alice Wheeler. I was a park ranger in the Superior National Forest back then, fresh out of training and eager to prove myself. The morning everything started, I was doing my usual rounds when the call came in over the radio. Dispatch reported multiple missing persons at Blackwood Lodge, a remote luxury retreat about 30 miles from my station. A guest had somehow made it into town despite the brewing storm, rambling about people changing and hunting the others. I remember thinking it was probably just rich city folks getting spooked by the isolation. We got calls like that sometimes, people unaccustomed to true wilderness letting their imaginations run wild. But protocol required investigation of all missing persons reports, so I radioed back that I'd check it out. The drive up took longer than usual. Snow was already falling heavily, coating the narrow forest road in treacherous white. My partner, Jim Hawkins, was supposed to meet me there. Jim had been a ranger for 20 years and knew these woods better than anyone. If something was really wrong, I'd want him backing me up. The first sign that this wasn't a routine call came when I pulled into Blackwood's parking area. In the growing storm, I counted 15 cars covered in fresh snow, but not a single track of footprints between them and the lodge. Just pristine white powder, as if everyone had simply vanished into thin air. The grand log building loomed ahead. 3 stories of dark timber against the gray sky. No smoke rose from any of its 5 stone chimneys. No lights shone in the windows. The place looked abandoned, except for one detail that made the hair on my neck stand up. The massive front door stood wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. I pulled my rifle from the truck and approached cautiously, scanning for any movement. The radio at my hip crackled with static, making me jump. Jim's voice came through, broken and faint.
Alice.
Don't. Inside. They're not. Anymore. Jim? You're breaking up. What's your location? Over. No response. Just more static. I tried again, but got nothing. The storm must have been interfering with reception. I knew I should wait for backup, but if there were people in danger, every minute could count. I stepped through the open doorway, snow swirling in behind me. The lobby was frigid, lit only by gray daylight filtering through tall windows. The usual mountain lodge decor surrounded me: stuffed animal heads, Native American artifacts, a huge stone fireplace. But something was wrong. The place looked like everyone had left in a hurry. Half-empty coffee cups sat on tables, some with lipstick stains around the rims. A newspaper from 2 days ago lay open on the front desk, and there was something else, a smell I couldn't quite place, metallic and organic. "Hello?" I called out, voice echoing. "Park Service? Anyone here?" The only answer was the wind moaning through the open door. I moved deeper into the building, checking rooms methodically. The dining room looked like a meal had been interrupted mid-service. Plates of half-eaten food, chairs pushed back haphazardly. In the kitchen, I found pots still on the stove, their contents frozen solid. That's when I noticed the first blood, just a few dark drops on the white tile floor, leading toward the walk-in freezer. My hand tightened on my rifle as I approached. The heavy metal door stood slightly ajar, wisps of cold air seeping out. I reached for the handle, heart pounding. Before I could grab it, something crashed upstairs, the sound of breaking glass followed by what might have been a scream, or might have been the wind. I spun toward the noise, torn between investigating and calling for immediate backup. The decision was made for me when the power went out, plunging the windowless kitchen into darkness. In that same moment, I heard it, a wet, crunching sound coming from inside the freezer, followed by something that might have been words but wasn't quite human speech. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped backward. trying to move silently. But my boot squeaked on the tile, and the sounds in the freezer stopped abruptly. Then came a new noise, the scrape of claws on metal. The freezer door began to open. I didn't wait to see what was behind that door. Training kicked in and I bolted, taking the back stairs 2 at a time. The sound that followed me wasn't footsteps. It was more like something large dragging itself across the floor, accompanied by rapid clicking noises that echoed off the walls. The second floor was a maze of identical hallways lined with guest rooms. Daylight was fading fast, and the storm outside had picked up, rattling the windows. My flashlight beam darted from door to door as I moved, looking for any sign of survivors. Most rooms stood open, their interiors in various states of disarray, suitcases emptied onto floors, beds unmade, personal belongings scattered. In room 217, I found the first solid evidence that something horrific had happened here. The bathroom mirror was shattered, and someone had written a message in lipstick on the remaining fragments. Don't sleep. When you sleep, they get in. Below the message, dark fingerprints smeared the porcelain sink. The mirror shards showed dozens of my own reflection, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them moved differently than the others. I backed out quickly. That's when my radio crackled again. This time, Jim's voice came through clearer. "Alice, where are you?" "I'm in the lodge. Something's wrong with my legs. So hungry." His voice changed on that last word, deepening into something that made my skin crawl. But he was my partner. I had to try to help him. "Jim, I'm on the second floor. Stay where you are. I'm coming to find you." "Hurry." Can't stop it much longer." I was so focused on the radio that I almost missed the movement at the end of the hall. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the window, too tall, too thin. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling. "Jim?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure turned. In the gray light, I could see that its neck was wrong, too long and bent at an impossible angle. But worse was its face. God, its face. The skin had stretched and split around a mouth that now contained far too many teeth, each one long and needle-sharp. It wasn't Jim. I recognized the tattered remains of a floral dress hanging from its emaciated frame. 2 days ago, I'd seen a photo of Mrs. Eleanor Bradford wearing that same dress in the local paper, announcing her family's winter vacation at Blackwood Lodge. The thing that had been Mrs. Bradford took a step toward me. Its joints moved wrong, like a puppet with extra strings. Another step. The floorboards creaked under its weight, which seemed impossible given how skeletal it had become. I raised my rifle, trying to keep my hand steady. "Stay back!" It cocked its head at an angle that should have snapped its neck, regarding me with milky white eyes. Then it spoke, and its voice was a horrible mixture of Mrs. Bradford's refined accent and something ancient and hungry. "We smelled you coming, Ranger Wheeler, your warmth, your meat. But you're too late to save any of them. The hunger spreads. They all changed so beautifully." It began to move toward me faster now, joints popping and cracking as it came. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling, but the sound only seemed to excite it. Its jaw unhinged, opening far wider than any human mouth could. I ran. Behind me, other doors began to open. More figures emerged, some still partially human, others transformed like Mrs. Bradford. The hallway filled with the sound of snapping bones and tearing flesh as they gave in to the change. Their screams mixed with the howling wind outside. I slammed through the fire door into the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. I could hear them pursuing, moving in that terrible, disjointed way. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, creating nightmare shadows on the walls. The first floor was no sanctuary. More of them waited there, blocking the front entrance. I caught glimpses as I sprinted past, a man in a torn business suit crawling across the ceiling, his head twisted completely backward to watch me. 2 children, their arms now elongated into razor-sharp claws, crouched in the darkness beneath the grand staircase. The kitchen was my only option. I ran for it, hearing them converge behind me. If I could just make it to my truck. I rounded the corner and skidded to a stop. Jim stood blocking the back door. But it wasn't really Jim anymore. His ranger uniform hung in tatters from a body that had grown and twisted. His face was the worst, caught halfway between human and something else, skin splitting around partially transformed features. Tears of blood ran from eyes that were now solid black. Alice. His voice was wet and sticky. I tried to warn you, tried to stop you from coming, but now you're here, and I'm so hungry. Time seemed to slow as I stared at what remained of my partner. Jim's new form filled the doorway, bones cracking as he grew even taller. Behind me, I could hear the others coming, their unnatural movements getting closer. I had one chance. I dove for the industrial stove, cranking all the gas burners to full blast. The clicking of the electric igniters filled the air, but in the power outage, no flame came. The sharp smell of gas began to fill the kitchen. "You can't stop it, Alice," Jim's twisted voice rasped. "The hunger. It's inside all of us now, so deep, so old." I backed away from both Jim and the approaching horde, moving toward the one place I hadn't checked, the lodge's small museum room. Every winter resort up here had one, filled with local artifacts and history. I'd caught a glimpse of it earlier during my search. Jim lurched forward, his movements jerky but terrifyingly fast. I fired 2 shots into his chest. The bullets tore through him but seemed to cause no pain. If anything, the wounds just gave the thing inside more room to emerge. I slammed the museum door shut behind me and wedged a chair under the handle. It wouldn't hold them for long, but I needed time. My flashlight beam swept across glass display cases filled with arrowheads, old photographs, and historical documents. Then I saw it. A leather-bound journal behind glass. The card beside it read, "Personal Diary of Father Thomas Blackwood, 1871. First owner of Blackwood Lodge." But what caught my eye was the page it was open to, showing a rough sketch of something horrifically familiar. A human figure twisted and elongated, its mouth distended into a tooth-filled maw. I smashed the case with my rifle butt. Outside, the pounding on the door grew louder, accompanied by inhuman shrieks. I grabbed the journal with trembling hands and began to read by flashlight. February 12, 1871. The Ojibwe elder finally told me why no native people will stay near the lodge. They say this land is cursed. In their legends, it was here that the first Wendigo was born from a starving man who turned to human flesh. The hunger lives in the land itself, patient and eternal, waiting to turn men into monsters. The elder warned that the curse spreads like a fever through groups of isolated people. One turns first, and their hunger infects the others. The victims begin to change as the ancient spirit possesses them, their bodies twisting as their minds are consumed by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. There is no cure once the transformation begins. The infected must be destroyed by fire, or they will spread the curse to others. The elder's last warning haunts me. The Wendigo is cleverer than a mere beast. It remembers who its victims were and uses their memories, their voices, to lure in others. The door exploded inward. Mrs. Bradford's twisted form squeezed through first, followed by others in various stages of transformation. The smell of gas from the kitchen was stronger now. In the hallway beyond them, I could see Jim approaching, now so tall he had to crawl on all fours like some terrible spider. My mind raced. Fire. It had to be fire. But in this enclosed space, with all the gas, I backed toward the room's sole window. Beyond it, the storm raged, thick snow reducing visibility to almost nothing. The transformed guests moved closer, their bodies contorting in ways that defied physics. Some still wore recognizable pieces of clothing. A child's Mickey Mouse t-shirt stretched across a grotesquely elongated torso, a businessman's tie dangling from a neck bent backward. "You smell so warm," they whispered in a horrible chorus of voices. So pure. Join us, Alice. Feel the hunger. Embrace it. I felt something then, a tickle in the back of my mind, a whisper of temptation. The hunger they spoke of, ancient and powerful, trying to take root in my thoughts. If I hesitated, I knew I'd be lost. My fingers found my emergency flare gun, loaded with a single shot. I had one chance to end this, to prevent the curse from spreading beyond the lodge. But the price. Jim's voice cut through the others, still holding traces of the man who had been my mentor. Alice, please. So cold, so hungry. Help us. My hand tightened on the flare gun. I am helping you, Jim. I fired at the exposed gas line running along the ceiling. In that frozen moment before the flare hit, I saw their faces change, the hunger replaced by something like relief in their milky eyes. They knew what was coming. Maybe they even wanted it. The explosion threw me backward through the window. I remember the shattering glass, the rush of icy air, and then the impact with the deep snow below. The blast wave rolled over me as Blackwood Lodge erupted into an inferno. Their screams changed then, no longer hungry, but almost grateful. The Wendigo voices mixed with human ones as the fire consumed them. Above it all, I heard Jim calling my name one last time, his voice, finally, his own again at the end. I lay there in the snow, watching the lodge burn. The flames roared higher, reaching into the dark sky as the winter storm swirled around them. Inside, the monsters that had been people I knew were returning to ash. The curse would die with them. But as I struggled to my feet, something caught my eye. Movement in the tree line. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing just beyond the firelight's reach. For a moment, I thought I saw Mrs. Bradford's floral dress, tattered and bloody. Then another shape beside it, wearing fragments of a ranger's uniform. More forms emerged from the darkness between the trees, their elongated limbs swaying like branches in the wind. I ran for my truck. The key turned on the third try, engine roaring to life. As I sped down the mountain road, my headlights caught glimpses of them moving through the forest parallel to the road, twisted shapes keeping pace with the vehicle, always just out of clear sight. The official report ruled it a gas explosion. 15 people were listed as dead, including Jim. The bodies were too badly burned for detailed examination, which was probably for the best. The few who had seen the transformed victims were dismissed as hysterical, their minds affected by trauma and smoke inhalation. But I know what I saw. I know what really happened at Blackwood Lodge that winter night in 1971, and I know they're still out there. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I hear them. Voices calling from the darkness, familiar voices that belong to people I couldn't save. They whisper about the hunger that never dies, about the curse that lives in these woods, patient and eternal, waiting for new victims. And on the darkest nights, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I swear I can see it. Just for a moment. A slight elongation of my features, a hint of too many teeth, a flicker of ancient hunger in my eyes. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the guilt and trauma playing tricks on my mind. But I keep my doors triple locked anyway. I never go out after dark. And I haven't looked in a mirror for very long in 50 years. Because the worst part isn't the memories of that night. It's not the faces I see in my nightmares or the voices that call to me from the shadows. The worst part is the hunger. The tiny, gnawing hunger that's been growing inside me. So slowly, I barely notice it. Year after year, decade after decade, getting just a little stronger, a little harder to ignore. And sometimes, on nights like tonight, when the wind sounds like their voices and the darkness feels alive, sometimes I'm so very, very hungry. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened in the Paradise Valley mine. For 60 years, I've carried this burden alone, letting the official report stand unchallenged. A tragic mining accident that claimed 12 lives, including that of Senior Ranger Victor Hayes. But I'm dying now, and the truth needs to be told. Someone has to know what's really down there, in case they ever come back. I was the junior ranger who worked with Vic that summer of 1964. The things we discovered in those tunnels. God help me. Sometimes I still hear the screams echoing in my dreams. It started on June 12th, a perfect Montana morning. The air was crisp and clean, heavy with the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. Sunlight painted the Absaroka Range gold, and from our ranger station you could see the entrance to Paradise Valley Mine cutting into the mountainside like a black wound. The call came in just after sunrise. Tom McClintock, the mine foreman, voice shaking. The main shaft. There's been a collapse. We've got 12 men trapped down there. I remember watching Vic grab his gear, that familiar routine suddenly feeling different, heavier. He was a big man, Vic Hayes, the kind of ranger other men looked up to. 20 years of service had etched lines deep into his weathered face, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Get the rescue team mobilized," he ordered, already heading for his truck. "And bring extra lights, lots of them." I should have noticed something was wrong right from the start. The collapse hadn't made sense. That section of the mine had been recently reinforced, and the support beams hadn't broken or splintered. They'd been gnawed through. But we were too focused on the rescue to see the signs. The mine entrance was chaos when we arrived. Families huddled together, women crying, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. The other miners stood in tight groups, faces grim. They knew better than anyone what being trapped below meant. Vic took charge immediately, organizing the rescue team into groups. I still remember his briefing. "We go in teams of 4, stay together, maintain radio contact. Priority is locating survivors and getting them out. Watch for unstable sections. This whole thing could come down on our heads." If only we'd known what we were really walking into. The first 100 yards were normal enough, just the usual mine darkness, our headlamp beams cutting through thick dust. The collapse had happened deeper in, past the second vertical shaft. As we descended, the air grew colder, damper. The walls seemed to sweat in our lamplight. We found the first body at the 400-foot level. I'd seen mining accidents before, but this was different. The miner, we later identified him as Joe Reeves, lay face down in the tunnel. His clothes were intact, but the flesh, dear God, the flesh had been stripped clean from his bones, like something had eaten him. Vic knelt beside the body, his face pale in the harsh lamplight. "What in hell could have done this?" he whispered. None of us had an answer. We found 2 more bodies in similar condition before reaching the collapse site. Each one the same, clothes untorn, but flesh methodically stripped away. The rescue mission had become a recovery operation, but even that didn't explain what we were seeing. Then we heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares, a soft clicking, like someone tapping fingernails against stone, echoing from deeper in the mine. And beneath it, something that might have been words, but in no language I'd ever heard. Vic signaled for silence. We killed our lights, standing perfectly still in the suffocating darkness. The clicking grew closer. Then our backup light caught movement, something pale and humanoid skittering across the tunnel ceiling like a spider. Its skin was translucent, showing dark organs pulsing beneath. Eyes like clouded marbles reflected our light. Before we could react, it vanished into a crack we hadn't even noticed. But we all saw what it was carrying, a crude pickaxe made from what looked horribly like a human femur. "Out," Vic ordered, his voice steady despite everything. "Everyone out." Now. We didn't argue. But as we retreated, we heard more clicking, more of those awful, not quite voices. There were more of them down there, hidden in the walls, watching, hunting. The next few days were a blur of arguments with mining company officials and local authorities. Nobody wanted to believe our story about pale creatures using tools made from human bones. They talked about toxic gases causing hallucinations, about the need to avoid panic. But Vic knew what he'd seen. We all did. He started digging through historical records, looking for patterns. Other accidents, where bodies were found stripped of flesh. Reports of strange sounds in deep mines. He found too many to be coincidence. Cases going back to the 1800s, all through mining country. The mining company wanted to seal the tunnel and forget about it. But Vic convinced them to let him lead one final expedition, to document everything and then collapse the deeper sections properly, to make sure nothing could get out. I begged to go with him. He refused. Someone needs to know the truth, he told me the night before, in case. He didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what he meant. The next morning, Vic and 3 volunteers entered Paradise Valley Mine for the last time. They carried cameras, lights, and enough dynamite to seal the lower tunnels permanently. Their radio transmissions for the first hour were routine. Then we heard the clicking. What followed? The screams. I won't describe them. I can't. The radio went dead after 3 minutes of hell. An hour later, the charges Vic had set detonated. The lower tunnels collapsed completely. The official report blamed a gas pocket ignition. Case closed. But I know what really happened. I've spent 60 years wondering if Vic's sacrifice was enough, if the collapse truly sealed them all in. Because 3 weeks after we sealed the mine, a family disappeared from their isolated ranch 10 miles away. The police found their clothes, intact and empty. And on the bedroom wall, scratched into the wallpaper with something sharp, were marks that looked almost like writing. I still check the news for any reports of missing persons in mining country, for clothes found without bodies, for strange marks on walls. And every time I find one, I wonder, did we really trap them all down there? Or did some of them escape? Some nights, when I can't sleep, I swear I can hear clicking in my walls. And I know, they're still out there, still hungry, still watching, still waiting. From the personal papers of James Cooper, Jr. Ranger Rhett, found after his death in 2024, Paradise Valley District, Montana Forest Service. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened in the Paradise Valley mine. For 60 years, I've carried this burden alone, letting the official report stand unchallenged. A tragic mining accident that claimed 12 lives, including that of Senior Ranger Victor Hayes. But I'm dying now, and the truth needs to be told. Someone has to know what's really down there, in case they ever come back. I was the junior ranger who worked with Vic that summer of 1964. The things we discovered in those tunnels. God help me. Sometimes I still hear the screams echoing in my dreams. It started on June 12th, a perfect Montana morning. The air was crisp and clean, heavy with the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. Sunlight painted the Absaroka Range gold, and from our ranger station you could see the entrance to Paradise Valley Mine cutting into the mountainside like a black wound. The call came in just after sunrise. Tom McClintock, the mine foreman, voice shaking. The main shaft. There's been a collapse. We've got 12 men trapped down there. I remember watching Vic grab his gear, that familiar routine suddenly feeling different, heavier. He was a big man, Vic Hayes, the kind of ranger other men looked up to. 20 years of service had etched lines deep into his weathered face, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Get the rescue team mobilized, he ordered, already heading for his truck. And bring extra lights, lots of them. I should have noticed something was wrong right from the start. The collapse hadn't made sense. That section of the mine had been recently reinforced, and the support beams hadn't broken or splintered. They'd been gnawed through. But we were too focused on the rescue to see the signs. The mine entrance was chaos when we arrived. Families huddled together, women crying, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. The other miners stood in tight groups, faces grim. They knew better than anyone what being trapped below meant. Vic took charge immediately, organizing the rescue team into groups. I still remember his briefing. We go in teams of 4, stay together, maintain radio contact. Priority is locating survivors and getting them out. Watch for unstable sections, this whole thing could come down on our heads. If only we'd known what we were really walking into. The first 100 yards were normal enough, just the usual mine darkness, our headlamp beams cutting through thick dust. The collapse had happened deeper in, past the second vertical shaft. As we descended, the air grew colder, damper. The walls seemed to sweat in our lamplight. We found the first body at the 400-foot level. I'd seen mining accidents before, but this was different. The miner, we later identified him as Joe Reeves, lay face down in the tunnel. His clothes were intact, but the flesh, dear God, the flesh had been stripped clean from his bones, like something had eaten him. Vic knelt beside the body, his face pale in the harsh lamplight. "What in hell could have done this?" he whispered. None of us had an answer. We found 2 more bodies in similar condition before reaching the collapse site. Each one the same, clothes untorn, but flesh methodically stripped away. The rescue mission had become a recovery operation, but even that didn't explain what we were seeing. Then we heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares, a soft clicking, like someone tapping fingernails against stone, echoing from deeper in the mine. And beneath it, something that might have been words, but in no language I'd ever heard. Vic signaled for silence. We killed our lights, standing perfectly still in the suffocating darkness. The clicking grew closer. Then our backup light caught movement, something pale and humanoid skittering across the tunnel ceiling like a spider. Its skin was translucent, showing dark organs pulsing beneath. Eyes like clouded marbles reflected our light. Before we could react, it vanished into a crack we hadn't even noticed. But we all saw what it was carrying, a crude pickaxe made from what looked horribly like a human femur. "Out," Vic ordered, his voice steady despite everything. "Everyone out." Now. We didn't argue. But as we retreated, we heard more clicking, more of those awful, not quite voices. There were more of them down there, hidden in the walls, watching, hunting. The next few days were a blur of arguments with mining company officials and local authorities. Nobody wanted to believe our story about pale creatures using tools made from human bones. They talked about toxic gases causing hallucinations, about the need to avoid panic. But Vic knew what he'd seen. We all did. He started digging through historical records, looking for patterns. Other accidents, where bodies were found stripped of flesh. Reports of strange sounds in deep mines. He found too many to be coincidence. Cases going back to the 1800s, all through mining country. The mining company wanted to seal the tunnel and forget about it. But Vic convinced them to let him lead one final expedition, to document everything and then collapse the deeper sections properly, to make sure nothing could get out. I begged to go with him. He refused. "Someone needs to know the truth," he told me the night before, in case. He didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what he meant. The next morning, Vic and 3 volunteers entered Paradise Valley Mine for the last time. They carried cameras, lights, and enough dynamite to seal the lower tunnels permanently. Their radio transmissions for the first hour were routine. Then we heard the clicking. What followed? The screams. I won't describe them. I can't. The radio went dead after 3 minutes of hell. An hour later, the charges Vic had set detonated. The lower tunnels collapsed completely. The official report blamed a gas pocket ignition. Case closed. But I know what really happened. I've spent 60 years wondering if Vic's sacrifice was enough, if the collapse truly sealed them all in. Because 3 weeks after we sealed the mine, a family disappeared from their isolated ranch 10 miles away. The police found their clothes, intact and empty. And on the bedroom wall, scratched into the wallpaper with something sharp, were marks that looked almost like writing. I still check the news for any reports of missing persons in mining country, for clothes found without bodies, for strange marks on walls. And every time I find one, I wonder, did we really trap them all down there? Or did some of them escape? Some nights, when I can't sleep, I swear I can hear clicking in my walls. And I know, they're still out there. Still hungry. Still watching. Still waiting. From the personal papers of James Cooper, Jr. Ranger Rhett, found after his death in 2024, Paradise Valley District, Montana Forest Service, I've been asked to provide a complete written account of the events at Twin Lakes. My hands still shake trying to write this, but the public deserves to know the truth. The official reports call it a series of tragic drowning accidents. Those of us who survived know better. I took the ranger position at Twin Lakes in spring 1977, transferring from Yellowstone after 12 years of service. The position seemed perfect. A quiet park in northern Wisconsin, 2 pristine glacier-carved lakes connected by a narrow channel, and a small but dedicated staff. My predecessor left suddenly, citing personal reasons. I should have asked more questions. The first death came in late May. A local fisherman, Bill Erickson, went missing on the North Lake. We found his boat 3 days later, drifting near the center, empty except for his tackle box and a half-empty thermos of coffee. The bottom of the aluminum hull had 3 long gouges, like something had tried to claw through from underneath. I wrote it off as damage from hitting rocks, though I knew the lake was too deep there for that to make sense. June brought 4 more disappearances, all swimmers, all in the North Lake, all vanishing without a trace. No bodies surfaced. The lake is deep, over 200 feet in places, but our sonar should have found something. The local papers started calling it the Twin Lakes Curse. Tourism dropped. Those who did come stayed strictly to the South Lake, which remained eerily untouched. I spent countless hours on the water, searching for patterns. The weather was always perfect when people vanished. No storms, no rough water, nothing to explain the deaths. But I started noticing things. The water would sometimes turn unnaturally still, like glass, even when wind should have caused ripples. Fish populations in the North Lake plummeted. And there were the sounds, deep rumbling noises from below that my sonar couldn't explain. July 4th weekend, everything escalated. The Carlson family was having a picnic on the North Shore. Their 8-year-old daughter Emily was playing in the shallow water when she started screaming. Her parents said she was yanked underwater so fast they barely saw the splash. Mr. Carlson dove in after her. Neither came up. Mrs. Carlson's hysterics about seeing something huge moving under the surface were dismissed as trauma. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was in that lake. Something that hunted. I called in Dr. Sarah Chen, an aquatic biologist from the university. We took core samples, ran tests, and set up underwater cameras. The data made no sense. Water chemistry was normal, but there were patches of water nearly 20 degrees colder than surrounding areas, moving against the current. The cameras kept malfunctioning, but one captured a massive shadow passing by, far too large to be a sturgeon or muskie. Late July, we found the first real evidence. A severed human arm washed up near the channel connecting the lakes. The tissue damage was unlike anything the medical examiner had seen. The flesh wasn't torn or ripped. It was methodically stripped away, layer by layer, like something had been feeding slowly over time. That's when I connected with James Morton, a cave diver who specialized in underwater recovery. He had equipment that could reach the deepest parts of the lake. What we discovered still haunts my dreams. The North Lake had a complex cave system 180 feet down. The sonar hadn't detected it because the openings were small, but they led to a vast network of underwater caverns. Inside, we found evidence of habitation. Not just one creature, but several. And they were keeping their prey alive. We found an air pocket in one of the larger caves. Inside were makeshift nests made from lake weeds and debris, and bodies, 27 of them, partially submerged. Some still alive, but changed. The cave walls were covered in a bioluminescent growth, that cast everything in a sickly blue glow. The victims were pale, bloated, missing limbs but somehow still breathing. Their eyes were clouded over, like cave fish. They didn't respond to our lights or voices. I organized a rescue mission immediately. 3 teams of divers, armed with spear guns and underwater lights. I led the first team while the others created a safety line to the surface. We were 200 feet down when the attacks began. They moved faster than anything that size should be able to. Our lights caught glimpses of pale, elongated bodies, somewhere between fish and salamander, but massive 20, maybe 30 feet long. They had rows of external gills that pulsed with an inner light, the same bioluminescence from the cave walls. Their heads were mostly mouth, lined with hundreds of needle-like teeth. The next few minutes were chaos. Screaming through regulators, lights swinging wildly, blood clouding the water. I saw Rodriguez pulled into a side tunnel, his emergency line snapping like thread. Chen's light disappeared next, then Morton's. I felt something grab my legs, pulling me down. The pressure was immense. My tank slammed against the cave wall, rupturing. I don't remember how I got out. The rescue divers found me floating face down near the surface, somehow still alive. Both legs were gone below the knee, the wounds cauterized by something acidic. I was the only survivor. They sealed off the North Lake after that. Concrete barriers block the channel now. The official story blames structural instability in the caves, says they're at risk of collapse. Warning signs and fences keep people away. But sometimes, on still nights, you can hear things moving in the deep water, calling to each other, waiting. I've seen the satellite photos from last month. The North Lake is changing color, turning darker. The biologists say it's just algae growth from the lack of circulation. But I know better. They're breeding down there, spreading through the cave system. And someday, those barriers won't be enough to hold them. I still dream about those caves, about the victims we left behind, suspended in that frigid water, kept alive by something that saw them as more than just food. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, slowly changing, becoming more like their captors. And I wonder how many other deep lakes hide similar secrets in their depths. This is my official report. Do with it what you will. I've requested a transfer to a desert park, somewhere far from deep water. Let someone else investigate when the things in Twin Lakes finally decide to expand their hunting grounds. Addendum. Derek Powell died of an apparent suicide 3 months after filing this report. His body was found in his bathtub, drowned in less than 6 inches of water. The coroner noted unusual chemical burns around his mouth and nose, and high levels of an unidentified organic compound in his tissue samples. The Twin Lakes remains closed to the public. The wolves shouldn't have been hunting in packs that large. That was my first thought when I examined the remains at Sawyer Creek. After 15 years as a park ranger in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I knew our timber wolves inside and out. They stayed in groups of 6 or 7 at most. But the tracks around the campsite told a different story. At least 12 distinct sets of prints, maybe more. And they were massive. I dealt with wolf prints my entire career, but these were half again as large as anything I'd ever seen. Some looked almost like, but no, that was impossible. I'm writing this account now, in December 1982, because people need to know what happened here. The official report calls it a tragic series of animal attacks. Newspapers blamed it on a particularly aggressive wolf pack, driven to desperation by the harsh winter. The handful of us who survived know better. My name is Howard Mitchell. For those reading this, understand that every word is true. I've spent months debating whether to share this story, knowing it could end my career or worse. But with another winter approaching and more wolf attacks being reported, I can't stay silent any longer. It began in late October. The first victim was a solo hiker, James Erickson, 34, from Marquette, an experienced outdoorsman who'd grown up in the area. They found pieces of him scattered across half a mile of forest. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, but I'd never seen wolves mutilate a body quite like that. The limbs weren't just torn off, they were arranged, like trophies. The second attack came 2 weeks later, a family of 4, camping despite the dropping temperatures. Only the youngest daughter survived, hiding in a hollow tree while something that walked on 2 legs and 4 legs tore her family apart. When we found her 3 days later, she was nearly catatonic. The only thing she would say was, they were talking to each other. Wolves don't talk. By early November, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The attacks always came at night. The victims were always in groups of 2 or more, and they were always played with first. Like cats toying with mice. We found half-eaten meals in abandoned camps, tents shredded but bodies left untouched for hours while something stalked the occupants through the dark. I tried warning my superiors, showed them the tracks, the patterns, the evidence that these weren't normal wolves. They didn't want to hear it. Tourist season was ending, but they still didn't want to cause a panic. They authorized a limited hunt, bringing in some professional trappers from Canada. We found the trappers 3 days later, what was left of them anyway. Their rifles had been snapped like twigs. The steel traps they'd set were arranged in a perfect circle around their mangled bodies. That's when the locals decided to take matters into their own hands. Led by Marcus Wheeler, a retired Marine who'd been hunting these woods for 40 years. They formed what they called a Citizen Safety Patrol, 20 men with high-powered rifles and more determination than sense. I tried to stop them. Told them they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Just wolves, Ranger Mitchell, Wheeler had said, checking the scope on his 30,006. Big ones, sure, maybe even rabid, but still just wolves. I went with them. Had to. If I couldn't stop them, maybe I could at least help keep them alive. We headed out on November 24th, the night of the full moon. Wheeler called it our advantage, better visibility for hunting. He didn't understand we were the ones being hunted. They let us walk 5 miles into the deepest part of the forest. Let us think we were the predators. We found their den just as the moon reached its peak, a cave system that shouldn't have existed according to any geological survey. The entrance was decorated with trophies, bones, scraps of clothing, wedding rings strung on leather cords. Then we heard the howls. Not wolf howls, not exactly. They started like normal wolves but shifted into something else, something that sounded almost like laughter. The sounds came from every direction. They had surrounded us. I'll spare you the details of what happened next. The screams, the begging, the way they picked us off one by one, herding the survivors deeper into the woods. How they seemed to take pleasure in our terror, communicating with each other in those horrible, not quite wolf sounds. Wheeler was the last to go. He emptied his rifle into one of them. I saw the bullets hit, saw blood spray from its chest. It didn't even slow down, just rose up on its hind legs, towering over him at nearly 8 feet tall. And I survived by playing dead, buried myself under the bodies of my friends and lay there, not moving, barely breathing, for hours. I listened to them feast, listened to them talk to each other in guttural sounds that were almost words. Dawn finally came. They retreated to their den, dragging their new trophies with them. I crawled out from under the carnage and ran until my legs gave out. The official report lists 18 deaths from animal attacks that night. Says the wolves responsible were never found. Claims the cave system I described doesn't exist, and it doesn't, not anymore. When I led a search party back 2 days later, the entrance had been collapsed, just smooth rock face where it had been. But I know they're still out there. The tracks appear sometimes, those massive prints that look almost like wolf tracks, but not quite. Always in groups of 12 or more, always after a full moon. And sometimes on quiet nights, I hear them howling, not like wolves, like something that's learned to imitate wolves. something that's learned to hunt like them, something that's learned to collect like humans do. I've requested a transfer to another park. They're processing the paperwork now. But I had to write this down first, had to warn someone, because I know what I saw that night. Know what's really out there in the Michigan wilderness. They aren't wolves. They never were. And they're getting better at hunting us. Note found paperclipped to the original manuscript. Addendum. February 1983. Rangers found Howard Mitchell's cabin empty yesterday morning. Door locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. Just massive tracks in the snow outside his window, at least 12 distinct sets. And on his desk, carved deep into the wood with what looks like claw marks. Thank you for the story, Ranger. I never wanted to share this story. For 33 years, I've kept these events locked away, telling myself that silence was the best way to honor my fallen friend Marcus Johnson and the others who died that humid Florida summer. But with the recent disappearances in the Everglades reaching the news, I can't stay quiet anymore. People need to know what happened in 1991, even if they don't believe me. I was a junior ranger then, fresh out of training and eager to prove myself. Marcus was my mentor, a veteran of 15 years with Florida Fish and Wildlife. He taught me everything I knew about the swamps, how to read water patterns, track wildlife movement, and most importantly, how to stay alive in one of America's most unforgiving ecosystems. The trouble started in late June. Marcus and I were mapping invasive python populations when he called me over to examine something strange. At first, I thought it was morning fog caught in the cypress trees. But as we pulled our boat closer, we realized it was webbing massive sheets of it, stretching between trees for hundreds of feet. I've never seen anything like this, Marcus said, reaching up with his pole to touch one of the strands. It was thick as rope and had an oily sheen that caught the morning light. Spider silk doesn't get this big. I remember laughing nervously. Maybe we've got some mutant banana spiders? Marcus didn't laugh. He was staring at something dark caught in the webbing about 20 feet up. Get the binoculars, he said quietly. I wish I hadn't looked. What I saw wasn't a banana spider, or any spider I'd ever seen. It was curled up tight, but I could tell it was bigger than a beach ball. Its legs were jointed wrong, too many segments, and its body was covered in what looked like overlapping plates rather than fur or chitin. The morning sun caught something that might have been eyes, dozens of them, arranged in symmetric rows across what I assumed was its head. We need to document this, Marcus said, already reaching for his camera. Could be a new invasive species. That was, Marcus, always the professional, even when faced with something impossible. He took several photos while I marked our GPS coordinates. We planned to return the next day with more equipment and hopefully a university researcher. We never got the chance. That evening, we received an emergency call from the small settlement of Cypress Grove, about 3 miles from where we'd found the webbing. The locals there, mostly Seminole families, who'd lived in the area for generations, were reporting strange noises and something attacking their livestock. Looking back, we should have called for backup immediately. But who would have believed us? We had no proof besides a few blurry photos of what could have been anything. So we went ourselves, arriving just as the sun was setting. Cypress Grove was only 12 homes set on stilts above the water, connected by wooden walkways. As we approached, I noticed the silence first. No dogs barking, no chickens, no sound of generators or voices, just the hum of insects and the occasional splash of something breaking the water's surface. "Hello?" Marcus called out, tying our boat to the main dock. "Florida Wildlife Service." Nothing. We drew our sidearms, standard procedure, when investigating potential predator attacks, and made our way up to the first house. The door was open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, the table was set for dinner, food still on plates, but covered in a fine layer of that same oily webbing we'd seen earlier. "Check the other houses," Marcus ordered. "But stay within sight. I'd only made it halfway to the next building when I heard him swear. Jesus Christ. Amy, get back here. He was standing in the doorway to what looked like a bedroom, his flashlight beam fixed on something inside. When I reached him, I saw what had caused his reaction. Cocooned to the wall in thick, ropey webbing was a human shape. It was desiccated, dried out like a mummy, but recent. You could still make out the features on what remained of the face. "We're calling this in," Marcus said, already reaching for his radio. Now, that's when we heard it, a wet, clicking sound from somewhere above us. We both looked up. They were on the roof, 3 of them, bigger than the one we'd seen that morning. In the beam of our flashlights, their armored plates gleamed wetly, and those symmetrical eyes reflected back like rows of tiny mirrors. One of them moved, revealing something clutched in its mandibles, a human arm, partially wrapped in webbing. What happened next is still a blur. We fired our weapons, but the bullets seemed to bounce off their plating. We ran, but they moved faster than anything that size had any right to. Marcus pushed me toward the boat, shouting for me to start the engine. I did, looking back just in time to see one of them catch him with a strand of webbing that shot from somewhere beneath its body. He managed to draw his knife, sawing at the strand while firing his pistol one-handed. "Go!" he screamed. "Get help!" I hesitated for a crucial moment, and that's when I saw them descending from the trees around us, dozens more, their bodies making that horrible clicking sound as they moved. Marcus was still fighting, but more strands were wrapping around him, pulling him up toward the waiting mandibles. "Go." It was his last word to me. I gunned the engine and didn't look back. The next hours were a nightmare of radioing for help, trying to convince people what I'd seen was real. By the time I returned with a heavily armed fish and wildlife tactical team the next morning, Cypress Grove was completely encased in webbing. We found 13 more desiccated bodies, but worse was what we found in what had once been the community center. The walls were covered in what looked like eggs, translucent sacks the size of basketballs, each containing something that moved. And inside some of them, through the membrane, you could make out human faces, twisted in expressions of agony, as something grew inside them. The military arrived by noon. They evacuated everyone within 10 miles and established a quarantine zone. That night, I watched from a safe distance as napalm rained from the sky, turning that section of swamp into an inferno. They bombed it for 3 days straight. The official story was that an illegal chemical dump had contaminated the water, causing mass hallucinations and deaths. The families of Cypress Grove were quietly compensated and relocated. The area remains restricted to this day, officially due to environmental concerns. But I know what I saw. And 2 weeks ago, when I read about the disappearances near Parkland, about the strange webbing found in the trees, and the clicking sounds people heard at night, I knew they hadn't got them all. I'm breaking my silence now because people need to be warned. If you're in the Everglades and you see anything like what I've described, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because the queens lay thousands of eggs at a time, and they're patient. They can wait. The frostbite took my fingers and toes, but that's not why I wake up screaming. What haunts me aren't the blackened stumps where my extremities used to be. It's the memories of what happened at Glacier Point Research Station in the winter of '94. I've never told the full story before. The official report lists an equipment malfunction that led to mass hypothermia. That's what happens when no one believes the sole survivor of a disaster. But I need to tell the truth, even if it sounds impossible. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. I was a park ranger stationed in Denali back then, doing the job I'd dreamed of since I was a kid. I loved the isolation, the pristine wilderness, the way the aurora borealis painted stories across the night sky. Even the brutal winters didn't bother me. I learned to respect the cold, not fear it. The distress call came in at 3:47 a.m. on January 12th. I remember checking my watch, watching my breath fog the glass in the beam of my flashlight. The signal was weak, breaking up into static, but I caught enough. Emergency. Glacier Point. Deaths. Need immediate. Then, nothing. Glacier Point was one of our more remote research stations, a cluster of prefab buildings where a team of climatologists studied ice core samples. They were about 4 hours out by snowmobile in good conditions. That night, with the temperature at -40 and winds howling like hungry wolves, it would take longer. I radioed back to base that I was heading out. Protocol said to wait for backup, but the forecast showed a massive storm front moving in. If I didn't go now, no one would make it through for at least a week. Besides, I knew these researchers had dropped off their monthly supplies just 2 weeks ago. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team lead, Marcus Williams, their equipment specialist, the others. Good people. I loaded up my emergency gear and headed out into the darkness. The cold hit like a physical wall, stealing my breath even through my insulated mask. My snowmobile's headlight carved a tunnel through the swirling snow, but beyond that bubble of light was nothing but blackness. The wilderness felt different that night, heavier somehow, as if something vast and ancient had awakened and was watching my progress with hungry eyes. The first sign something was wrong came about 3 hours in. My GPS showed I was still on course, but the temperature gauge on my suit was showing impossible readings. -70, -80, then -90. I checked for malfunctions, but everything else was working fine. The cold felt different, too sharper, more aggressive, like it was actively trying to find ways through my gear. I spotted the station's lights through the darkness around 8 a.m., though the sun wouldn't rise for hours yet that far north in winter. The main building was dark, but emergency lights pulsed in 2 of the satellite structures. As I pulled up, I noticed the snow around the base was wrong. The drifts were misshapen, with smooth-sided depressions that didn't match any weather pattern I'd ever seen. The front door was locked, frost thick around the edges. I had to use my override key, and the metal was so cold it tried to stick to my glove. Inside, emergency lights cast everything in a dim red glow. The entrance area was pristine, too pristine. No boots by the door, no coats on hooks. The team was meticulous about their entry procedures to prevent contamination of their samples, but this felt different. It felt staged. "Hello?" my voice echoed in the silence. "Dr. Chen? Marcus? This is Ranger Cooper. I'm responding to your distress call." Nothing. Just the low hum of the heating system. I drew my sidearm standard issue for Predator defense and moved deeper into the facility. The main lab was empty, computers still running but workstations untouched. Coffee cups sat on desks, contents frozen solid. A chair was overturned near the door. The first body was in the break room, Marcus Williams, or what was left of him. He was frozen, not like normal hypothermia victims. This was different. His entire body was encased in a layer of perfectly clear ice, like he'd been dipped in glass. His face was contorted in terror. One hand reached out as if warding something off. The ice around him had spread across the floor in crystalline patterns I'd never seen before. I keyed my radio, trying to call for backup, but got only static. The storm must have worsened. A noise from down the hall made me spin around, a soft scraping sound, like ice shifting against ice. "Dr. Chen?" I called out. "Anyone?" "Elizabeth?" a voice responded, shaky and thin. Oh, thank God. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from one of the labs, and my heart sank. She looked terrible, skin pale as milk, frost crackling in her hair. Her movements were stiff, mechanical. "What happened here?" I asked, keeping my distance. Something felt wrong. "It came out of the ice cores," she said, her voice cracking. We thought we were just seeing temperature anomalies in the samples, but we found something. Something old. Something that's been waiting. What are you talking about? Where's the rest of the team? Dead. Or changed. Ice crystals formed at the corners of her mouth as she spoke. It gets inside you, through your breath, through your skin. Then it spreads. She took a step toward me, and I saw that her footprints left trails of spreading frost. The temperature around her was dropping rapidly. I could see the digits on my suit's display plummeting. "Stay back," I warned, raising my gun. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's beautiful, Elizabeth. The cold. It shows you things. Makes you part of something greater." She reached out, her fingers now transparent as ice. "Let me show you." I fired twice. The bullets hit her center mass, but instead of blood, she shattered like a broken window. Fragments of what used to be Sarah Chen scattered across the floor, each piece containing a fraction of her frozen expression. The scraping sounds were getting louder now, coming from multiple directions. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw something move, a shape like flowing water but made of living ice, rippling across the ceiling. Another emerged from a vent, and another from beneath a door. They were semi-transparent, their interior structures shifting and reforming like crystalline muscles. I ran. Behind me, the temperature plummeted so fast the metal walls cracked. I could hear them moving, flowing like liquid nitrogen, but alive, so alive. One dropped in front of me. I emptied my clip into it, the bullets creating spiderweb patterns that sealed themselves instantly. The next few hours are fragmented in my memory. I remember barricading myself in the communications room, trying desperately to get a signal out. I remember the creatures flowing through every crack, turning the air itself to ice. I remember finding Roberts, the junior researcher, still partially alive as the ice spread through his body like cancer. "They're not killing us," he gasped, crystals forming in his eyes. "They're preserving us, making us like them, perfect, eternal." I lost 3 fingers to frostbite getting out of that room. The emergency generator gave out around hour 6. In the darkness, they became bolder. I could see them more clearly then. Their bodies were like flowing glass, but inside were structures that might have once been human organs, perfectly preserved. They moved with terrible grace, reaching out with pseudopods that froze everything they touched. I made my last stand in the sample storage room, surrounded by ice cores that had contained these things for God knows how long. Through the window, I could see the storm had grown impossible, snow falling upward, ice crystals forming in patterns that hurt my eyes. The rescue team found me 2 days later, hypothermic and missing most of my fingers and toes. The creatures were gone, retreated back into the ice or deeper into the facility. The bodies of my friends were gone too. Just empty rooms filled with intricate ice patterns remained. They demolished the facility, of course, buried everything under tons of snow and pretended it never happened. But I know the truth. Those things are still out there, deep in the ice, waiting. And they're spreading. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I swear I can feel them. In the bite of the wind, in the frost on my windows, in the way ice forms in impossible patterns in my freezer. They're patient. They have all the time in the world. And the ice caps are melting. Scientists say we found bacteria and viruses preserved in ancient ice, waiting to be released as the planet warms. But I know we found something else too. Something that's been waiting millions of years for its chance to return. I still have nightmares about those last moments at Glacier Point. But lately, they're not just nightmares. The cold feels different now, hungry. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror first thing in the morning, I swear I can see ice crystals forming in the corners of my eyes. I've been a Nevada State Park ranger for 17 years. The desert holds secrets. That's what I always told visitors who asked why I chose such a desolate post. But after what happened in Red Rock Canyon in the summer of '96, I wish some secrets had stayed buried. My name is Philip Reeves. I'm writing this from a secure military facility outside of Carson City. The doctors say putting it all down might help with the nightmares. Maybe someone needs to know the truth, even if they'll never believe it. It started with the missing hikers, 3 in 1 month, unusual for our area. The search parties found nothing, No bodies, no equipment, not even tracks leading away from their vehicles. Just empty cars in the parking lot, like their owners had vanished into thin air. I'd been mapping some of the lesser-known cave systems when reports came in about strange noises from the northern caverns. High-pitched buzzing, locals said. Like cicadas, but wrong somehow. Too mechanical, too purposeful. The caves out there were mostly unexplored. Miles of twisted limestone tunnels honeycombing the bedrock. Perfect place for someone to get lost, or for something to hide. Sarah Chen from the biology department joined me for the initial survey. She'd been studying the desert ecosystem for years and knew these formations better than anyone. The rock here is different, she said, running her fingers along the cave wall. See these marks? Like something's been eating through it. I shined my flashlight where she pointed. The limestone was pockmarked with perfectly circular holes, each about the size of a quarter. They formed elaborate geometric patterns that seemed to pulse in the beam of light. My skin crawled, just looking at them. We found the first body 200 feet in, or what was left of it. The flesh had been changed somehow, hardened and translucent, like amber. Through the waxy surface, we could see dark shapes moving. Sarah leaned in closer, fascinated despite herself. "Phil," she whispered, "these aren't decomposition effects. This tissue is being transformed." That's when we heard it, a low thrumming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It built slowly, resonating in our bones until our teeth ached. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "We need to leave, now." We barely made it out before the buzzing overwhelmed us. It felt like being inside a giant speaker, every cell in our bodies vibrating in sympathy. The last thing I remember is Sarah screaming, clutching her ears as something dark and chitinous emerged from the shadows. I woke up in my truck 3 hours later with a splitting headache and no sign of Sarah. When I reported her missing, the local sheriff seemed oddly unconcerned. "People wander off sometimes," he said, his voice flat. "Desert's a dangerous place." But something was wrong with his eyes. They were glassy, unfocused. And when he turned his head, I caught a glimpse of a small, perfect circle behind his ear. That's when I started noticing things about the town. The way people moved, slightly too rigid, their blank expressions, the constant, almost subliminal hum that seemed to follow them. And the holes, those same geometric patterns appearing in buildings, in trees, in the very ground itself. I tried calling for outside help, but the phones were down. Internet too. The town was completely cut off. Through careful observation, I pieced it together. Whatever lived in those caves, whatever had been waiting down there for God knows how long, it wasn't just killing people, it was changing them, using them. The holes were its way in, tiny burrows that let its offspring access the nervous system through the ear canal. Once inside, they wrapped themselves around the brain stem and took control. I found Sarah's research notes hidden in her office. Pages of increasingly frantic observations about insectoid parasites, prehistoric hive minds, and something she called the Great Awakening. The last entry simply read, "They're hatching. God help us all." By then, it was too late. The entire town was compromised. I watched in horror as my friends and neighbors were transformed into empty vessels, their bodies serving as incubators for the next generation. The buzzing grew louder every day as more eggs reached maturity. When I found my wife and kids, they were already gone. Their eyes were black and empty, their skin taking on that same waxy translucence. Something moved beneath the surface when they smiled at me. "Join us, Daddy," my little girl said, her voice overlaid with a strange chittering. "It doesn't hurt at all." The military quarantine came too late. They sealed off the town, but we all know it's just buying time. The hive is growing, spreading. I can feel it even now, calling to me through the walls of my hospital room. The doctors don't understand why my vital signs spike every full moon, or why I keep scratching at that spot behind my ear. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm back in those caves. But this time, I see what Sarah saw in her final moments. The vast chamber deep underground, walls pulsing with millions of eggs. The ancient queen, bigger than a house, her chitinous segments reflecting our flashlight beams. And worst of all, the faces of the missing, perfectly preserved in their amber cocoons, waiting to be reborn as something new. They tell me the town is still under quarantine, that the caves have been sealed with concrete, and the area declared a military testing zone. But I know better. You can't stop them. They've been here longer than us, waiting in the dark, and soon, very soon, they'll be ready to spread their wings. I'm writing this as a warning, though I doubt it will make a difference. If you're reading this, and you start hearing that buzzing, that deep, bone-shaking hum that makes your teeth ache and your thoughts scatter, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Just run. And whatever you do, don't look behind your ear. I've worked as a forest ranger in Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest for 23 years. The things I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of 1999, though sometimes I still wake up convinced it was all just a nightmare. I wish it had been. But the scars on my body and the empty spaces on the map where 3 towns used to be tell me otherwise. My name is Nathan Brooks. I was the senior ranger for the Norwich district back then, responsible for about 40,000 acres of pristine wilderness. The job mostly involved trail maintenance, helping lost hikers, and making sure campers didn't start forest fires. That changed when Paul Chen, one of our seasonal rangers, failed to radio in at the end of his shift. It was July 15th, warm but not hot, with that sticky Vermont humidity that makes your uniform cling to your skin. I remember because I'd just finished logging a complaint about illegal logging activity near the Miller Creek area. Some residents had reported heavy machinery sounds at night, though our permits showed no authorized operations in that sector. "Nathan, you copy?" The radio crackled with Dave Murphy's voice, our dispatch operator. Paul's 2 hours overdue. His last check-in put him near Beaver Pond Trail. "Copy that, I'll head over and check it out." I grabbed my gear and jumped in the ranger truck. Paul was new but reliable. This wasn't like him. The sun was setting by the time I reached the trailhead, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Something felt off right away. The air was too still. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. I'd spent enough time in these woods to know when something wasn't right. I found Paul's vehicle parked at the trailhead, everything normal except for one detail that made my skin crawl. All of his gear was still inside, including his radio and water bottle. No ranger would ever start a patrol without those. "Paul," I called out, my voice echoing strangely among the trees. "Paul Chen." The beam of my flashlight caught something odd on a nearby oak tree. At first, I thought it was sap, but sap isn't red, and sap doesn't leave smears that look like desperate handprints. That was the moment everything changed, not just for me, but for everyone who lived near these woods. I didn't know it then, but I was staring at the first sign of something ancient waking up, something that had been dormant for centuries until we disturbed it. I radioed in and requested backup. Within an hour, we had a search party organized, standard procedure for a missing ranger. But what we found that night was anything but standard. The first thing we noticed was the ground. The forest floor was covered in dead leaves in July. They crunched under our boots, dry and brown like late autumn, except the trees above us still had full green canopies. Several team members commented on it, but we were too focused on finding Paul to really think about what it meant. About a mile in, we found his flashlight. The lens was cracked, and the aluminum casing was crushed like it had been squeezed by a giant hand. Next to it was a notebook, its pages filled with Paul's increasingly frantic handwriting. Trees moved, not wind. Saw them move, getting closer. Need to keep moving. The last entry was a jagged line trailing off the page. We split into teams to cover more ground. I took the eastern section with 2 state police officers, following what looked like a trail of disturbed vegetation. That's when we found the first tree out of place. It was a massive maple, easily 100 years old. But there was something wrong with its position. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, and this tree wasn't supposed to be here. More importantly, the ground around its base was disturbed, with long grooves in the soil leading back the way we'd come. "That's impossible," Officer Martinez whispered, shining his light on the tree's roots. They weren't normal roots. They were twisted, gnarled things that looked more like tentacles, and at their tips were what looked horribly like fingers. A scream cut through the night, high-pitched, desperate, coming from the Western search team. We ran toward it, boots pounding against the earth, branches whipping at our faces. When we arrived, we found 3 rangers staring up at something, their flashlight beams shaking. It was another tree, but this one had Paul. He was 20 feet up, completely encased in bark that had grown around him like a cocoon. Only his face was visible, frozen in an expression of pure terror. The bark wasn't just covering him, it was inside him. We could see places where it had pushed through his uniform, through his skin. That's when we heard it, a sound like groaning wood, but wrong. It came from all around us, a chorus of creaking and splitting that made my teeth ache, and the trees were moving, not swaying in the wind, moving, rotating slowly on their bases, reaching. "Run!" I screamed. Not my proudest moment as a leader, but it saved lives that night. We lost 2 more people during the retreat. The trees were faster than they should have been, their branches grabbing like hands, roots erupting from the ground to trip us. I saw Officer Martinez yanked into the canopy so fast, he didn't even have time to scream. When we finally made it back to the vehicles, only half the search party remained. That's when I realized the horrible truth: the trees hadn't been chasing us. They had been hurting us, driving us toward the deeper parts of the forest. We'd chosen to run the other way, but that had been luck, not wisdom. The next few days were a blur of emergency meetings, scientific experts, and increasingly desperate attempts to understand what we were dealing with. Dr. Sarah Martinez, no relation to the officer we lost from the University of Vermont's biology department, was the first to put the pieces together. "The forest is a single organism," she explained, pointing to satellite photos. "The trees are like neurons in a vast brain, or perhaps better thought of as fingers on an enormous hand. The logging operation." She paused, swallowing hard. "We think the logging operation damaged part of it, like poking a sleeping giant with a stick. And now it's awake. And it's hungry." The satellite images showed something else. The forest was expanding. Trees were appearing in places where no trees had been the day before. The entire forest was slowly, inexorably moving toward populated areas. We tried everything. The National Guard came in with flamethrowers and heavy equipment. The trees just absorbed the damage, healing themselves faster than we could hurt them. Chemicals designed to kill plants only seemed to make it angry, and all the while, people kept disappearing. It wasn't just hikers or rangers anymore. People would vanish from their homes at night, windows found broken by branches, doors smashed by roots that retreated back into the earth by morning. The forest was hunting us. The evacuation order came too late. The forest had already cut off the major roads, trees bursting through the asphalt like living barricades. 3 towns, Norwich, Hartford, and Pomfret, were completely surrounded. I led the evacuation effort, organizing convoys through the rapidly closing gaps in the forest's net. We lost so many people. The trees would let us think we'd found a safe route, then close in all at once. I still hear the screams, still see the branches reaching down into cars and plucking people out like berries from a bush. The last convoy was the largest, nearly 1,000 people and everything from school buses to pickup trucks. I was in the lead vehicle, guiding them through a route I'd found that followed a dry riverbed. The trees had trouble growing there, giving us a narrow corridor of relative safety. We were halfway out when I saw it. The forest was closing in behind us, moving faster than I'd ever seen it move before. And ahead, trees were starting to burst from the ground, their roots reaching for the vehicles like hungry fingers. I knew then what I had to do. I ordered everyone to drive straight through while I turned off into the trees, firing flares and shouting, making myself the most obvious target I could. The forest took the bait. I felt an almost conscious shift in its attention, like a predator turning its head toward easier prey. The convoy escaped. I didn't. The trees caught me about a mile in. I still don't know why they didn't kill me immediately like the others. Maybe the forest had learned enough about humans by then to want to study one up close. Maybe it was just playing with its food. I spent 3 days in a living cage of branches and roots, watching as the forest slowly consumed the 3 towns it had surrounded. Buildings collapsed as roots undermined their foundations. Streets vanished under a carpet of hungry vegetation, and everywhere the trees moved, searching for anyone who might have hidden well enough to survive. On the 4th day, a root punctured my leg, and I felt the forest trying to get inside me, trying to understand how I worked. The pain was unbearable. In desperation, I pulled out my lighter. I'd always carried one, against regulations, and set myself on fire. I expected to die, but the forest released me. I fell 20 feet to the ground and rolled, putting out the flames. Then I ran, stumbling, my burned skin screaming with every movement. Somehow, I made it out. The military quarantined the entire area. They built walls of concrete and steel, posted guards with flamethrowers. It's contained, they say. It can't spread any further. But I know better. I've seen the satellite photos they try to keep secret. The forest is still there, still alive, still thinking. The trees move a little bit every night, testing the walls, learning their strength. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, you can hear the sound of roots growing deeper, spreading further, reaching out. They find empty rooms sometimes, inside the containment zone. Empty rooms in empty buildings in empty towns, their walls covered in a red sap that analysis shows is partially human. And scratched into these walls over and over are the same words. The forest is patient. The forest can wait. I'm retiring next month, moving to Arizona, where the desert stretches as far as the eye can see. I've had enough of trees. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear them whispering. They're spreading underground, sending roots like fingers through the dark earth. And they're still hungry. Always hungry. If you live near a forest, do me a favor. Tonight, when you're lying in bed, listen carefully. That creaking sound you hear? It might just be the wind in the trees. Or it might be something else. Something that's learning to walk.